Today, we're going to be deep diving into 3 different approaches you can use to lower the volume output of your drum set that won't cost you a dime and that you can mix and match based on where you're going to be playing. Today's video is not going to be about mesh heads or cymbals with a million holes in them or anything else really gear oriented like that. This is about your drums and getting less volume out of them when you're performing. We are also not going to be swapping out implements in an effort to get a quieter sound because we really believe that implement choice should be about the sound you want to produce and not just a stopgap measure for needing to be a little bit quieter. This isn't going to be a comparison video per se, but we do want to share the sound of the drums up front before we start changing anything up, so let's hear them as they are right now. We're going to be attacking this issue from 3 different angles today, and they're all going to apply whether you are struggling with neighbors that are frustrated with the amount of noise you're making, or you're performing in a space where a quieter sound would be more effective, or even if you're playing in a group where the overall volume of the group would really benefit from a lower dynamic. First up, and please go with us on this, the simplest way to get a quieter sound out of the drums. Just don't hit them as hard. Now, before you click away and consider that we have fully lost our minds here, just think about this for a second. If you always hit your drums the same way with the same amount of intensity, sure, you're going to be married to that dynamic level, and that's okay maybe 70, even 80% of the time. But what if you could get a really great sound out of the instrument that's articulate and punchy and sounds good without that volume threshold? Now, I know this is a little bit of a reach, maybe for your ears or for your eyes, or maybe even for both, but consider that this is the first thing we need to think about when we're considering being quieter. It's true that the tone changes. I'm actually noticing that the pitch even sounds a little bit different in the toms because the velocity is lower, so we're not moving as much air and moving the heads as much, which actually presents a slightly lower pitch. What we really are talking about here is the idea that height is volume. It's not about the intensity of the swing, and if you can learn to play as you do, but at a lower height, you're de facto going to get a quieter sound, which can still be clean and clear and sound like sticks, which is really what we're looking for here. For those of you that play at a higher dynamic level pretty much all the time, consider this as cross-training. We are working the smaller muscle groups and gaining more strength for the whole mechanism, which means when you go to play harder, you're going to have more stamina, you're going to experience less fatigue, and you're going to have more control, since after all, an awful lot of that control is coming from the fingers, even if we're playing from the shoulder. If you're enjoying today's experiment, please follow the link below to the Patreon. It's going to be a lot of extra content over there, and it's the best way to allow us to continue making these videos at whatever volume threshold we want. In looking at the actual technique approach here, there are a couple of things that we can talk about specifically with the sticks, how we're holding them, and how we choose what stick we're going to use. When we hold a stick by the very end, we have a very long piece of wood with not a lot of back weight coming out of the other side of your hand, which means that you have the most possible leverage to swing that weight into the drum, which is frankly why a lot of guys that hit really hard will hold the sticks at the ends. I am particularly guilty of this, and I don't care because it gets me the sound that I'm looking for, especially being a traditional grip player who likes to get really loud. Consider that if you choke up the stick like many players do, and actually, ironically, I think of people like Ilan Rubin who are hard hitters but use a longer stick so that they can adjust their dynamic by the placement, you actually have less weight at the tip of the stick, which again is going to lower your volume. It's going to lower how much leverage you have, while at the same time still sounding like a stick. Holding the stick at different points along the length of it is also going to work your muscle groups a little bit differently, which you can consider to be a kind of cross-training, and also just an opportunity to check in with your technique and see what happens when the weight feels a little bit different or you have more stick out of the back of your hand. It's also very important to consider the stick itself that you use. Now, we can't all afford to buy every stick under the sun and consider how they're going to affect our playing, but one thing that is very true is that a longer taper is going to afford you both more rebound and generally a softer dynamic at a given velocity. It's as simple as this: if there's less weight at the tip of the stick, whether it's because we're choking up on it or using a stick with a much longer taper, you're going to have to swing harder to get that same volume. Ultimately, before you consider buying anything else, whether it's bundle rods or a different kind of stick, consider really getting to know the full length of the sticks that you're using in terms of that leverage and start to get closer to the drum with your technique. All of that's going to change your entire dynamic range. And now a word from some companies that have been tracking your activity on the internet. Next up, let's talk about what we can do with tuning. Tuning is the trickiest out of the three of these, primarily because we're still dealing with wide open drums. We're not introducing any muffling into this, and for the purposes of this portion of the demonstration, I'm not going to hit softer to get a softer dynamic. I'm going to try and see if I can get these drums to chill out just by changing the tuning. If you've ever heard us talk about John Bonham or other classic rock guys that use really big drums tuned higher than you would expect, that's about projection and tone. So it seems to me that what we ought to do is lower the tension on the drums to get some of the tone and sustain out of them, simply because they're not tuned high enough to generate it. Let's have a listen now that I've made some adjustments to these. I'm going to speak in generalities about what we did to these drums because, again, your mileage will definitely vary with your instruments in your space, with your technique and all of that. But the main thing that we did is we lowered the tension on both the batter and resonant heads on the toms. I also lowered the tension on the snare batter. I lowered it a little bit on the snare side, but I actually raised tension on the rods away from the wires for the sake of articulation and almost to choke the drum out just a little bit so it would be punchier and a little less sustainy. For the bass drum, we made some different adjustments. We lowered tension on the resonant head, and basically, that was kind of it. Obviously, the pitches out of these instruments are now different than the first demonstration, but again, we're not trying to match or compare pitches here. We're just going for a certain kind of character, when ultimately, in the context of a band, the exact pitch of these isn't as important as their character and the way they behave. Every one of these solutions has gains and losses. In this case, we are changing the pitch. We are also losing some rebound. It might feel a little bit different to play things that are familiar at your comfortable dynamic. Anytime we're trying to make these adjustments, we are going to have some concessions we're going to have to make, and it doesn't really get in the way in this case, but we are getting a much shorter, punchier, and less sustainy sound, which is allowing me to hit harder with a lower dynamic. This is a good time to mention that you can mix and match any 2 or 3 or 10 different ways that you might discover to achieve these sorts of sounds and behaviors in your drums. None of these is a silver bullet to fix a situation. These are actually ingredients for a recipe that will work for you in your circumstances, and we want to parse them out today so you can hear them individually. We are going to move on now to the big elephant in the room. Well, I mean, it's always in the room. It's muffling. Let's give these a listen, and then we'll talk about what we did. Muffling has been around forever, and oftentimes it is used to either attenuate frequencies or to shorten and punch up the sound of any drum on the drum set. Today, we have returned these drums to right around where they were tuned when we first started out, but we are adding a significant amount of muffling to them with what we have around, which today is E-rings. The nice thing about rings such as these is that if they are out of your price range or hard to get where you are, you can make them out of used drum heads with a little bit of ingenuity. We've done that a lot here. The big thing we're doing today is we actually have 3 of them stacked up on each of the drums for a couple of reasons that we're going to get into. Let's talk about the toms first. Each of the toms has 3 rings stacked on the batter head, and we are doing this both for the tremendous amount of mass and also to stabilize them, because if you only have one on there and you're really hitting hard, it can fly off and you end up having to tape it down or figure out some way to immobilize it so that it doesn't come off during performance. For the snare drum, we actually stopped at 2 rings today because that was more than enough to get us to where we needed to go. And again, this is about drawing down the sustain and quelling high overtones, which can be perceived as loud, when in reality, the drum itself is still pretty loud. Because we know not everybody wants to get on board with the Patreon, we have to do another ad break. When it comes to the bass drum, because E-rings for a bass drum are not really a thing, we are using a big pillow that's pressed pretty firmly against the batter head. We've had it in the drum the whole time, but it was oriented so that it wasn't putting any pressure on the heads and giving us a more wide open sound. We've also added in a rolled up towel against the inside of the resonant head because we needed a little more pressure to get where we needed to go. This is the most dramatic sound difference, I would say, of anything that we've done today, and the gains and losses are pretty apparent. We have punchier, shorter, and overall quieter sounds on all of the drums, but we've also lost a fair amount of articulation, fair amount of high end, we've lost all the sustain, and we're down to something that almost sounds like a gated or a sampled sort of sound. Granted, this is an extreme version because we're trying to actually make them as quiet as we can with rings, but this is also something that you could walk back or do to some degree and check out exactly what's going to work for you. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves reiterating. None of these are anything I would do to this extreme individually in a performance situation. These are ingredients that you can mix and match based on your needs and in the environment that you're in to get a sound that's going to work for you. I strive mostly to do whatever I can with just the drumsticks before I even start to retune things. So personally, I think that it would be really great to begin with just technique and see how far you can get through that practice. Again, even if you're not a quiet player or you don't find yourself in quieter situations when you're performing. This is also not limited to people who primarily play quieter music overall. Hard-hitting drummers can benefit from this as well, especially if you're finding yourself moving through really varied performance environments. Like, stage volume can get out of hand in any size environment, and if you can adjust your technique even a little bit, it can make everybody's lives easier. Particularly something as simple as if a sound engineer perhaps says, could you play, 20% quieter? If that sounds scary, then this is what we should be working on. Drums are loud, and being loud is fun. But remember that if you practice these things, it's going to open up new worlds of possibility and allow you to be even more effective, no matter where you're playing or who you're playing with.